Hello everyone, welcome to Auspol Explained. I'm your long curly haired host as always, David, and today we're going to be talking about the infamous dismissal of Gough Whitlam in 1975 by the Governor-General John Kerr. And with me via Zoom is an expert in this. Could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, David. I'm Professor Jenny Hocking. I've written a two-volume biography of Gough Whitlam. Gough Whitlam, A Moment in History is Volume 1, and Gough Whitlam, His Time is Volume 2. I've also written a book called The Dismissal Dossier, Everything You Were Never Meant to Know about November 1975, and another book detailing my High Court action to get access to the Queen's letters to Sir John Kerr at the time of the dismissal, which again shed enormous light on just what was happening behind the scenes and the pressures on Kerr to dismiss the government and who else was involved.
I mean, you've also contributed to other books like, The Dismissal, not to brag about the bookcase behind me, but yes, you do play a prominent feature. I actually think I see a copy of this one behind you as well. Many, many books about Gough Whitlam, and of course the palace letters that go into the details of what Kerr was thinking and who he was talking to during it. So instead of the audience having to read all of this, let's have a bit of a summary. Let's get into the history of it. So for those who are unfamiliar with the dismissal, this is a big moment in Australian political history. It happened 50 years ago, 11th of November 1975. So after 23 years of coalition rule, Labor managed to finally win government in 1972, and the coalition did not take kindly to Gough Whitlam's reformist policies. He found a lot of difficulty trying to pass a lot of things, and eventually the Liberals decided to block supply to prevent the government from actually withdrawing money with parliamentary approval. And this led to a standoff where Gough Whitlam was like, "You're going to back down," to the Liberals, and the Liberals went, "Nope, you're going to call an early election." And instead of resolving that political crisis through the two parties talking to each other, eventually John Kerr, the Governor-General, intervened, dismissed Gough Whitlam, appointed Malcolm Fraser, the leader of the Liberals, as the Prime Minister, and allowed him to call an election as Prime Minister, resulting in the 1975 landslide election victory for the coalition. This happened before Gough Whitlam could actually advise his own half-Senate election. John Kerr knew that Whitlam was coming to him on the day to advise a half-Senate election to try and resolve the deadlock, but Kerr effectively went, "Nope, I've made up my mind, I'm dismissing you before this can happen." Very controversial moment, led to lots of protests and early resignation from Kerr, and has captured the attention of the Australian public for the past 50 years. So let's take a step back. Let's work through it chronologically. What would you say is really the beginning of the dismissal crisis? When did it all start?
The dismissal just started when the Whitlam government was elected. I mean, as you said quite rightly, David, this came after 23 years of Conservative government in Australia. And I think that is a really vital and essential contextualising element for the dismissal, to understand the horror with which the election of a Labor government was greeted by the Liberal and Country parties. You have to go back to that time and see their response to the election of the Whitlam government. The leader of the Liberal Party in the Senate, Senator Reg Withers, said within a few weeks of the election of the Whitlam government that this was the result of the temporary electoral insanity of the Australian electorate, and the election of a Labor government was an aberration. And he said then, in March 1973, that the Liberal Party and the coalition would use their numbers in the Senate effectively to bring down the government if it had that opportunity. So from the very beginning, there's a critical factor of a refusal to accept the legitimacy by the Liberal Party of the election of a Labor government. And if you think, particularly for your younger viewers, if you imagine 23 years of repeated government by one party or another, and I think it doesn't matter which party that might be. It's a shocking state of affairs for the way in which our parliamentary system works, in which one party is therefore seen as the legitimate party of government, and the other struggles, as the Labor Party did in 1972, to achieve a legitimacy through the parliament. So moves against the government started at once. We had a record number of bills rejected by the Senate at that time. It was actually fairly rare for government bills to be consistently rejected by the Senate, even though the Senate often was not made up of the same numbers of the government of the day. But just an indication of that, more bills were rejected by the Senate in the 3 years of the Whitlam government. In those 3 years, more bills were rejected by the Senate than had been rejected by the Senate in the entire 72 prior years since Federation put together. So it's an extraordinary number of bills that were rejected, but at the same time, an extraordinary record number of bills was passed, because the Whitlam government was an extraordinarily strong reformist, agitating government.
The thing that finally took down the Whitlam government was the blocking of supply led by Malcolm Fraser, but he wasn't the first one to even try and do that. Like, I believe Billy Snedden also, when he was Liberal leader, tried to block supply in the Senate.
The situation in 1972 was that the election had been for the House of Representatives alone. So the Senate did not go to a half-Senate election, much less a full election, in 1972. Whitlam was elected and inherited a Senate that was made up of senators that had been elected up to 5 years earlier. Half the Senate had been elected in 67 and the other half in 1970. So you had a very, if you like, outdated Senate made up of people who really reflected a political time up to 5 years earlier. And of course, they were highly antithetical to the Labor Party at that time. That meant that the coalition had a clear majority in the Senate, and the leader of the Liberal Party, the leader of the opposition, Billy Snedden, announced in early 1974 that they would use those numbers in the Senate to try and force the Whitlam government back to another election just 18 months after it had been elected. Now, the 1974 attempt, and it was an attempt, not a successful move, to block supply, is, for political nerds like me, extremely interesting, because it's the only contemporary comparator to what Sir John Kerr then did the following year. And in my view, the Governor-General, Sir Paul Hasluck, who was the Governor-General in 1974, handled that threat to supply far more successfully than John Kerr did in 1975. When the Senate moved to put forward an amendment that would have led to the deferral of supply in 1974, Whitlam had already discussed with the Governor-General, Sir Paul Hasluck, what the response ought to be in order to secure the passage of supply. And Hasluck said to Whitlam that he would grant Whitlam's wish for an election, a double dissolution election at that point, and that Whitlam's leader in the Senate, that is Senator Murphy, would go back into the Senate and let the Senate know that the Governor-General had supported Whitlam's advice for a double dissolution election, conditional on supply being passed. That meant that if the Senate was going to continue with its move to block supply, it would not only be moving against the government, it would also be moving against a decision of the Governor-General that he would grant Whitlam the election of his choice, and at which point the Senate then passed supply bills. So the way in which Hasluck worked with Whitlam at that time was constructive. It protected responsible government, and it ensured that supply was passed. And it was a model for what Kerr should have done the following year, when the Senate did defer a vote on supply and demanded an election. And instead, Kerr remarkably and inexcusably refused to speak to Whitlam about his options at that time.
Snedden gets removed as leader Fraser comes in, he's a bit more aggressive about this and makes more demands. To his benefit, I suppose, the loans affair happens, and this gives him a further excuse to pursue this tactic of deferral of supply. Could you briefly tell us what the loans affair was?
Malcolm Fraser replaced Billy Snedden as leader, and Fraser was seen as an extreme, much more right-wing, much more of a defence hawk during the Vietnam War, for example. He'd been very gung-ho about the prosecution of the war. And interestingly, he was loathed but respected as a leader in the Liberal Party. The former Liberal Prime Minister, John Gorton, left the party furious after Fraser's elevation to the leadership, and stood as an independent in the next Senate election, which is quite extraordinary that a Liberal Prime Minister, a recent Liberal Prime Minister, would resign rather than serve under Malcolm Fraser. So he was a highly polarising figure, even within his own party, and he was determined that once again the Liberal Party would block supply and force the government to a third election in as many years. And yes, the move towards this needed something big to justify taking such an extreme measure. And there were many, many episodes dubbed with this epithet affair to create a sort of ongoing sense of crisis about the Whitlam government. We had the Gare affair before the double dissolution, an attempted blocking of supply in 1974, which, believe it or not, was simply the appointment of a senator from the DLP to an ambassadorial position, not exactly an unheard of action. And the loans affair related to an Executive Council meeting in December 1974, where the Whitlam government was given authority by the Executive Council, signed off by Sir John Kerr the following morning. He was not there at the meeting himself, but it was chaired by the Vice President, which is, again, not an unusual situation. And it was to seek funds to the tune of 4 billion American dollars to underwrite an extensive program of minerals and resources exploration, public ownership, and the creation of an enormous pipeline from the Northwest Shelf in Western Australia all the way down across to the eastern seaboard. And this would have brought, the Whitlam government argued, a degree of energy self-sufficiency. It would have brought profits back into the country rather than in the hands of private resource companies that, as we well know, take those profits offshore and pay very little, if any, tax on them. So it was a radical program of resource and mineral development, and it was driven by one of the strongest ministers in the government, Rex Connor, who was determined to find the funds to enable what was called the Petroleum and Minerals Authority to begin functioning in that way. The outcry over it really was because twofold. It was because the government was looking at what was seen as unconventional financial sources, and they were sources effectively from the Middle East, which was seen as being awash with funds after the OPEC countries had increased the price of oil fourfold in the early 1970s, leading to an enormous amount of money that was available for loan raising at relatively low interest rates. And the other contention about the Executive Council meeting was that Whitlam's Attorney General Lionel Murphy advised that it could be seen as raising funds for temporary purposes because the loan was only a 20-year loan that was being sought, and therefore this particular stage in the fundraising did not have to go to the Loans Council, which was dominated by the Conservative state governments and would most certainly have not been happy with the direction the Whitlam government was going in with its resource development plans. So it was a fundraising that did not last long. It was reduced the following January to $2 billion search for loans, and ultimately the fundraising was cut altogether a couple of months after that in June. So no loans were actually attained, and it was an attempt to underwrite the Petroleum and Minerals Authority that ultimately did not succeed.
Rex Connor was accused of misleading Parliament, and he ended up resigning from. No, he was fired from his position, wasn't he?
Yes, one of the outcomes, and there are a couple of government minister resignations related to loan raising at that time, but the one that really was used by the coalition as the precipitator for the blocking of supply was the resignation, as you say, the forced resignation of the Minerals and Energy Minister Rex Connor. The person that Rex Connor had been liaising with, hoping to raise funds through, was a Pakistani finance trader, Tirath Kemlani, and Tirath Kemlani was brought out to Australia in the months before the blocking of supply and brought with him documents, including italics, that he then presented, stating that Connor had continued to negotiate with him and to urge him to seek funds even after Connor's authority to do so had been withdrawn. So this was enormously damaging for the Whitlam government. The resignation of Connor was seen as another scandal, and that's the point at which Malcolm Fraser made it very clear he would move to bring down the government, describing it in the most extreme terms, like the worst government in Australian political history, and so on. So that led by October to the opposition's decision to block supply in the Senate.
To be clear, Fraser's issue was with unconstitutional raising of funds. He claimed that it was bypassing Parliament, but the money was never loaned, and the minister responsible was no longer the minister after it happened. So effectively, really, the loans affair was resolved with the resignation of Connor, and Fraser just used it as an excuse to continue what the coalition had been wanting to achieve since 1972, which was get rid of Whitlam. Correct? Is that an accurate way of describing it?
I think it's absolutely right to say that the loans affair had no meaningful relationship to the actual blocking of supply in terms of the mechanics involved. It had nothing to do with it. What it did do was become part of the amplified political noise, if you like, around the government, which Fraser and others then used as a justification for moving to block supply. And it's very interesting that in the Liberal Party records, which I've actually been to fairly recently, the campaign committee, it was called, which Fraser really gave new life to and insisted ought to be, literally campaign ready from the middle of the year, even though it was only barely a year since the last election, actually talks about the need to have something big, something like the Gare affair, in order to precipitate the second attempt to block supply in as many years. So, yes, the loans affair became this very sort of, I would say, overblown moment, but one that didn't actually have any literal connection to the blocking of supply. And I think people often misunderstand that and think that somehow the loans affair was Whitlam trying to raise funds to continue in government without supply. No, it was something that had actually happened in December 1974 and had long since ended.
Let's talk about the actual blocking of supply and how that could actually be achieved. So the results of the 1974 election actually weren't that bad for Labor. I believe they lost one seat in the House of Representatives. In the Senate, they got 29 seats. The coalition got 29 seats, and then there was an independent, I believe, which does not give the coalition a majority. It does not give them the numbers to block supply. But the Senate at the end of 1974 was not the same Senate that caused Whitlam problems in 1975. As Whitlam says, it was a corrupted Senate. How did it get corrupted?
It got corrupted because at that time, and this was changed in 1977 by referendum, at that time, if a senator left or died in office, the replacement senator had always, by convention, been a senator from the same political party to maintain the same electoral equity, you would say, as at the previous Senate election. However, this was a convention, and it was a convention that had always been followed since the system that has been in place was introduced. And as you say, in 1974, both the Coalition and Labor in the Senate had 29 senators. Labor had increased its Senate numbers at the 74 double dissolution. The DLP had lost all 5 of their senators, which had a really critical impact on the makeup of the Senate. There was 1 independent. Now, that independent had formerly been in the Liberal Party in Tasmania, and a few months after the election returned to the Liberal Party, which gave the Liberal Party at that point 30. And the South Australian senator from the Liberal movement, Steele Hall, was the other senator. And he always said he would support the government on supply. He was vehemently opposed to the blocking of supply. So even with those changes, you still have 30-30. Now, the critical fact is that to defer a vote on supply requires an amendment to the supply bill, an amendment that the bill not be considered, that it be returned to the House of Representatives with a demand for an election, that the government face the will of the people, is the wording used. So that actually required a simple majority. It required that the coalition have a majority of 1. What happened in early 1975 is that Whitlam's Attorney General, Lionel Murphy, was appointed by the Whitlam government to the High Court of Australia. And at that point, the New South Wales Premier said he was so outraged by the appointment of a Labor Attorney General to the High Court, something which Liberal governments had done before. Garfield Barwick had moved directly as a minister and previously Attorney General in the Menzies government to be Chief Justice of the High Court. But apparently with Lionel Murphy, it was an outrage that necessitated appointing a non-Labor senator in his place. That non-Labor senator was Cleaver Bunton, and much to the disappointment of the opposition, Cleaver Bunton said that while he was not a member of he would not be voting with the Labor Party on all things, he would vote on the government on supply. So you're back to square one on supply. The critical distinction is that that set up a pathway for altering the political makeup of the Senate. And with the death of a Labor senator, Bert Milliner, later in 1975, the Queensland Premier, Joe Bjelke-Petersen, appointed a right-wing member of the Labor Party, vehemently opposed to Gough Whitlam, Albert Field, in his place, who was promptly expelled from the Labor Party. And Albert Field took up his position and publicly stated he had joined the Senate and gone to Canberra for one purpose, and that was to defeat the Whitlam government. And with his vote, or rather without the vote of the person he replaced, because there was a High Court challenge to him sitting, but without the vote of Bert Milliner, the Labor Party senator who had died, that gave the Liberal Party, the coalition, that extra vote to support a vote to defer supply.
This is not the only time that the states come into this. Fraser now has the numbers in the Senate to defer supply, but he also knows that Whitlam might try and call a half Senate election. So he also instructs state premiers who are non-Labor premiers, if the Governor-General comes knocking and says, hey, could you advise the governor to issue a half Senate election writ or whatever, advise the governors to say no, because it actually is the governors of each state that issue the half Senate or Senate election writs. I believe, if my timeline is correct, the Liberals told the premiers to advise the governors to say no to the Governor-General before they deferred supply, right?
This had been discussed on and off, and I think it's a bit of a moot point because it is, as far as the constitutional setup is, if a half Senate election is called and the state-based premiers obviously have to issue the writs, because technically the Senate obviously is made up of state-based senators. Technically the premiers are the ones that actually set that process in train by issuing writs. However, the advice that was received within government was that even if certain states chose, and it would be a ludicrous situation for them to choose this, not to have representation for half their senators from the Liberal Party, that the election could be called nevertheless. And under Section 13 of the Constitution, the half-Senate election was due at that time, and it was due at any time between July 75 and the end of June 76. So this was the only election that, when the coalition moved to block supply, was actually due to be held. And it was also the only election that would have held to account the Senate, which was the body that was actually blocking supply, disrupting government, and not enabling the government of the day to continue with its everyday activities. And so it was perfectly clear, it was no secret to the Governor-General or to the Australian public that the outcome of this blocking of supply from the Whitlam government would be to call the half-Senate election. This was announced on the day, 16th of September, that the coalition actually finalised the blocking of supply in the Senate. A Labor caucus that night unanimously agreed that if supply continued to be deferred and the Senate refusing to vote on it, demanding an election, if that continued, then Whitlam would call the half-Senate election at a time of his choosing. So it was to be Whitlam's decision when to activate that. But the half-Senate election was the government's final outcome of that, and always was. And Kerr knew that, the Governor-General knew that, Malcolm Fraser knew that. In fact, Fraser made it very clear, and others around him, that if the Governor-General granted Whitlam, as he had to, as his vice-regal representative granted him the half-Senate election, that was Whitlam's formal advice. The Governor-General would have had no option but to grant that Fraser's strategy would have fallen apart. The Liberal senators had already indicated they would pass supply, and Fraser himself indicated that if the half-Senate election is called, we will pass supply. So a solution was at hand. There was no issue had Kerr gone ahead and actually accepted Whitlam's advice, which in my view, he ought to have without question.
Well, let's get down to actually what John Kerr did. So he is considering what to do long before it actually gets to a real crisis point. So you mentioned Barwick earlier. He actually goes to Barwick and Mason, two judges on the High Court, and asks them in an informal sense about the reserve powers. He does this, I believe, before supply is actually deferred.
One of the really bizarre things about Kerr, and I think quite frightening things about the fact that Whitlam appointed him, is that even before he took up the office, one of his keen interests that he discussed with Justice Mason, and Mason describes in his statement about his advice to Kerr, that was released, 40 years later. So we're all in the dark in history about so much of this. But both Mason and Justice Robert Hope, who was another close colleague of Kerr's, spoke to Kerr about the possibility of him taking up the position. Whitlam had offered it to him, and even though Whitlam asked for complete confidentiality, Kerr immediately goes to these two senior legal figures, tells them he's been offered the job, and talks to them about whether he should take it. And both of them said, it is a job without power. It will be a nominal position. Why would you leave your Chief Justice of the New South Wales Supreme Court job for something so relatively minor? And he corrected both of them and said, no, this is a job with quite a bit of power. And he pointed to the reserve powers. And Justice Mason astonishingly says he specifically referred to the potential to use the reserve powers at some time in the future. I find that absolutely remarkable, but this is what Mason indicated that Kerr was particularly interested in. And much later, when he's in the job already, he actually is talking about the potential use of the reserve powers to dismiss the government if supply is blocked. Months before it's happened, he has secret meetings with senior members of the ANU law faculty, which Professor Geoffrey Sawyer sort of disdainfully describes as the Governor-General's tutorials, in which he wants to gather advice about just what his reserve powers will enable him to do. And of course, we know because of the release of the palace letters between Kerr and the Queen that he first raised the possible use of the reserve powers to dismiss the government with Prince Charles, who is now our king, in September 1975 during the Independence Day celebrations in Port Moresby. So it's extraordinary that all of these people are well aware that Kerr is contemplating that he will use the reserve powers to dismiss the government for months before he actually does so.
Mason did actually tell him, hey now, you can use reserve powers, but before you do, right, because one of the things that the Governor-General is allowed to do is advise, consult, and warn, you should warn Whitlam that you're going to use the reserve powers before you do. And Kerr went, thank you for the validation that I know that I'm allowed to use the reserve powers. And the second bit got entirely ignored. So yeah, let's talk about Kerr and how he very much knew he was allowed to do this, and he was considering this as a possibility before the crisis actually culminated.
He was interested in the use of power, and specifically the reserve powers, before there was even a block of supply in the Senate to necessitate or even consider such a dramatic move. I think it's really important to remember, what is the Governor-General? The Governor-General is an appointed official. The Governor-General has no connection to the electoral process. He or she has no mandate whatsoever. He is, in that sense, a product of the government of the day, effectively, because Governors-General are appointed on the advice of the Prime Minister. And that is an essential part, the defining part of a constitutional monarchy. We have a parliament, but at the same time we have as our head of state a dynastic royal family that provides our head of state and still has what are called residual crown powers, the reserve powers of the crown. They have been devolved to the Governor-General as her representative in Australia. And until the events of 1975, it was unthinkable that a Governor-General would dismiss from office a government that retained its majority in and the confidence of the House of Representatives, as Gough Whitlam did at all times. Because the way in which we bring those two conflicting aspects of our system of government together, the fact that we have a monarchy within a constitutional setting, is that the monarch and her representative or his representative act on the advice of elected ministers, that is, responsible ministers. And that is their connection to the parliamentary process. And the shocking thing about Kerr, I think, is twofold, that he saw his position as Governor-General as effectively a judicial office. And the Governor-General is not a judicial appointment. The Governor-General is a product of the parliamentary structure, the democratic conventions that go with that, the central one of which is that they act on the advice of elected government. And not only did Kerr not act on advice and knew very well that the advice of the government was to call the House-Senate election, which Whitlam was entirely entitled to do, but he chose to remain, as he says himself, silent to the Prime Minister about it. And that was unforgivable. It was a moral failing on Kerr's part. He claims he feared for his own job, which is a shocking reason to not fulfil your responsibilities as Governor-General. He feared that Whitlam might dismiss him, to which you might say, so what? Whitlam made no moves to remove Kerr in the aftermath of the dismissal. He did not contact Buckingham Palace for many hours, despite what some commentators that you've had on this have previously suggested. And when he did, he made no effort to be reinstated as government. That process should have happened and did happen through the Parliament. The Parliament, in the aftermath of the dismissal, continued to sit. And this, again, is something that is often forgotten in the focus on the events of in the Governor-General study on the 11th of November. Not only did the Senate continue to sit after 1 o'clock, after 2 o'clock on the 11th of November, so too did the House of Representatives. The Senate passed supply soon after 2 o'clock. The House of Representatives, meanwhile, once Malcolm Fraser had stood up and announced that he had been appointed Prime Minister by the Governor-General, which up to that point Whitlam was not aware of. You have to remember that Whitlam was labouring under extraordinary lack of knowledge of what the Governor-General had done. He was unaware that Fraser was in one part of Yarralumla, hiding in an anteroom, while the Governor-General was dismissing him in his study. And as he left through one door, Malcolm Fraser emerged from the other to be appointed as Prime Minister. Whitlam did not know that until Fraser stood up in the Parliament at about 3:15 on the 11th of November and announced it to the House. Now, the House at that point passed a motion moved by Whitlam, which was a want of confidence motion, a no confidence motion in the appointed Fraser government. And that same motion reaffirmed its support for a Whitlam government and called on the Governor-General to recommission a government led by the member for Werriwa, that is Gough Whitlam. So you have the House of Representatives reaching its decision on the formation of government. The Speaker is dispatched to go and tell Sir John Kerr that the House wishes, the Parliament has spoken. Supply has meanwhile been passed at least an hour earlier. Kerr, at that point, he decided he would not hear the motion of the House of Representatives. He would not recognise the Speaker. He kept the Speaker waiting for over an hour, and in that time, together with his appointed Prime Minister, Malcolm Fraser, he passed all of the documents that were to call the double dissolution election, which was the election that the Leader of the Opposition wanted, not the election that the previous government, the elected government, had wanted, which was a half-Senate election. And the basis, to rub salt into the wound, the basis for calling the double dissolution was 21 bills of the Whitlam government that the Fraser-led coalition had twice rejected in the Senate, thus fulfilling the requirements of Section 57. So you have this extraordinary way in which Section 57, which had been used so creatively the previous year to pass 6 critical bills of the Whitlam government, was used a year later to enable the repeated obstruction of the opposition to the tune of 21 bills that had been obstructed twice, rejected twice by the opposition, to be used as the basis to allow the opposition to be appointed to office, call a double dissolution election, with the Whitlam government having to fight that election as opposition, with all of the difficulties that then entailed.
Kerr did multiple things. One, consulted with judges beforehand that he could use the reserve powers. Two, made up his mind that Whitlam was impossible to talk to. Correct? He was just like, he does not want to entertain the possibility of an early election, so decides that is his justification for not really talking to Whitlam about the crisis nearly as much as Whitlam would have liked him, or his own advisors outside would have liked him. But also Fraser, admittedly with the permission of Whitlam, was talking directly to Kerr. However, Kerr and Fraser had more meetings than Whitlam knew about to discuss the crisis. What was happening there? Was Kerr friendly with Fraser? Was this just like a formality to sort of consider the possibilities in the crisis and be informed? What was happening with Fraser and Kerr?
It's really important to remember, I think, that the Leader of the Opposition has no constitutional relationship with the Governor-General. None whatsoever. He or she is simply the leader of the party that lost the previous election. And this is why all of the Governor-General's expected roles and functions are, other than the ones that are clearly defined within the Constitution, are based on the advice of elected government, to be exercised on the advice of elected government. Calling the half-Senate election, for example, would be on the advice of the government. So it was not unusual that in meeting with Kerr, Fraser went through the advice of Whitlam. or rather Kerr went through the advice of Whitlam. Whitlam said, you may meet with Fraser if you inform me and I, support you meeting on particular times. So Whitlam was very generous in that sense. He could have said to Kerr, well, actually, no, you have no relationship with the leader of the opposition. You can't meet. So Kerr, it was a lasting sort of pillar of the dismissal history that Kerr and Fraser did not meet and did not speak to one another about the circumstances of the blocking of supply, other than on the publicly stated 3 or 4 occasions in which they met with Whitlam's knowledge and support. That is not true. And that held for decades. This is how the history of the dismissal has become so muddied over the years, is that there was so much dissembling at best, dishonesty at worst, and the hiding of documents, including in our own archives, which should have been made public, which would have made these matters much clearer. It was Reg Withers, who by that time had been burnt by Fraser as minister and was a former minister with a grudge, and that's a very dangerous thing. And it was Reg Withers who then revealed that, in fact, Fraser had spoken to Kerr on the morning of the 11th of November 1975, which both he and Kerr had always insistently and outragedly denied from the moment of the dismissal on. They had agreed on the terms on which Kerr would appoint Fraser Prime Minister, and there were 5 key points, and that was before the dismissal itself. What Reg Withers also revealed in an interview that was posthumously released was that, in fact, Kerr had been contacting Fraser on his private office line in his office in Parliament House. Withers recounts that he was present in during one of these phone calls from Yarralumla to Malcolm Fraser in the week before the dismissal. And when Fraser put down the phone, Withers says he looked at Withers and said, "You didn't hear any of that?" And Withers said, "I heard nothing at all." And so, in other words, that conversation didn't happen. You're never going to repeat it. And Withers didn't repeat it until this interview that was only released after he died. So secrets of the dismissal are manifold, and they continue to emerge as new documents are released from the archives. I think far too late. We ought to have all of those documents released now from our own national archives.
Let's actually talk about the Senate. Supply still had a couple of weeks to go. I mean, this was a bit of a crunch point. Whitlam wanted a half Senate election. Some people might be like, but senators start their term on like the 1st of July. And he's introduced legislation that territory senators exist and they would start their term basically immediately. So this is the possibility that it could resolve the crisis. He's trying to force Fraser to back down, and Reg Withers in the Senate, referred to as I think it was like the toe cutter was his nickname or something. He was very strict as trying to enforce party discipline, but the cracks were starting to show. Reg Withers later in an interview said it was a matter of hours. Neville Bonner, also a Liberal senator, was like, we were going to crack. Was there any inkling that Kerr would have known that the Liberal Party was about to crack? Because it would have taken one vote to crack, and supply could have been passed and the entire crisis would have been resolved, which seemingly could have potentially happened that day had Whitlam not gone to Government House just for several hours, right? Is that an accurate way of what could have happened?
Yeah, no, it's not speculation. It was speculation until I went and had a look at the diary that was kept by one of those so-called wavering senators. There was a group of senators in the Liberal Party who were always known as the wavering senators. They were the key ones. They were meeting together. They were led by Alan Misson, but as you say, Neville Bonner was one of them. Eric Bessell, Don Jessup, I think Kondo Lauke, there were others in a group that were most unhappy with the blocking of supply. This is why it was so imperative for the opposition that it had the numbers to defer supply, because they had the numbers to reject supply, because that would have only taken a 30-30 vote. However, those senators had always said they were not prepared to reject supply. No opposition had ever rejected supply previously, or even for that matter, deferred supply. But they were persuaded, shall we say, to go along with the party decision to defer supply, but they were not prepared to do so indefinitely. There is a wonderful document, and as a historian, you read these documents and they send shivers down your spine, but there is a wonderful document in Alan Misson's papers. And if I could find the heading of it, I would read it out to you. But it's something like, this is a note for history of the events of the last month of October, November 1975. And it goes through what those wavering senators are feeling from their initial extremely reluctant agreement that they will vote with the opposition to block supply. And it says that by the last week before the 11th of November, that is the week before that final decision on supply, on dismissal, the six of them had decided that when the supply bills next came up before the Senate, they would abstain and allow the supply bills to pass. And it's an extraordinary document because it finally shows what had been widely suspected at the time, that they were indeed ready to pass supply. And they were not aware, as most of the Liberal senators and the Labor senators were not aware, that the government had been dismissed when the supply bills went up on the afternoon of November the 11th, 1975. And so this extraordinary situation in which they all think they're voting for a bill that is for the Whitlam government, in fact, is being passed for a government that has been installed by the Governor-General. So it's just a remarkable situation. But yes, they were about to crack. Neville Bonner said later that they were within hours of passing the supply bills. Alan Misson's diary now shows that that is indeed the case. But Whitlam, of course, was not aware that Kerr had set these conditions on Fraser. He was not aware that Fraser had even been appointed Prime Minister until he came into the Parliament and announced that later that afternoon. So it's very easy for us to look back and say, oh, why didn't Whitlam do X, Y, and Z? What Whitlam did was hope that expect the institutions to be respected and the government to be formed in the House of Representatives and supply to be passed by the Senate. And the Speaker of the House, Gordon Scholes, was so distressed, I think is the only word, by what the Governor-General had done in not expecting Malcolm Fraser to resign, having lost the motion of no confidence, that he wrote to the Queen the following day in the strongest possible terms, pointing out that it was a contempt of Parliament to continue with a Prime Minister imposed on it through the use of the reserve powers by the Governor-General and not through a decision of the House of Representatives or the representations of the House. It's a very powerful letter, and the Queen, of course, through her private secretary, wrote back the following week and immediately said that the Queen has no part to play in decisions made by the Governor-General.
The day of the 11th, Kerr and Whitlam's account of the events differ. Kerr, I believe, says the dismissal's upside down and I'm going to give Whitlam a chance. But he doesn't actually explicitly say in his account, you have an option, or I flip over this paper. Whereas Whitlam is like, comes in, and before he can even advise a half-Senate election, to prevent that advice being formally given to Kerr, Kerr goes, you are dismissed. Could you elaborate on that fateful moment? What actually happened?
Kerr had clearly made up his mind some days earlier. He prepared the documents, he says himself, from at least the 9th of November. I think the really telling thing is that he had exchanged with the Prime Minister's office the documentation about calling the half-Senate election, because, as we said earlier, it's a complicated process to call the half-Senate election. Each of the states needs to be brought in terms of the timing of the issuing of writs, whether it's suitable for, all sorts of reasons like football finals, holidays, etc., whether it's an appropriate date to call it in each state. There was the added complexity of the 4 new territory senators that had just come in, 2 for the ACT, or would come in, 2 for the Northern Territory. And there were also the two replacement senators, because don't forget that the replacement for Lionel Murphy and the replacement for Bert Milliner would actually take their places immediately as well. So you are actually going to have 6 senators take their place the moment after that half-Senate election. And that's what was giving the coalition grave concern that there was a sliver of hope that in a good result for the Labor Party, they may just have what was called temporary control of the Senate until the remaining senators took their place the following year. So it's a very complex set of circumstances, and it's one in which Whitlam's office had to liaise with the Governor-General's office to get all this wording right. So the idea from Kerr that Whitlam hadn't really yet called the half-Senate election is a sophistry in the sense that you never just call the half-Senate election. There are several steps and processes you have to go by, which involve the Governor-General. So the Governor-General was well aware that they were calling a half-Senate election. And in fact, you could see in the archive files from the Prime Minister's department, ever since supply was blocked, there's a sort of rolling tally of when the half-Senate election could be called, what dates had to attach to each part of that process, and so on, fully knowing that that was the outcome that was going to be called. So there's a degree of dissembling again from Kerr in his suggestion that he wasn't aware of that. He was. In fact, his office specifically asked Gough Whitlam's head of department, John Menadue, to send them a draft of the letter that he was giving Kerr that morning. So they had a draft of that letter already and were well prepared for what was going to happen on the afternoon of November the 11th, 1975.
Yes, so it's this big shock. Whitlam is just dismissed. Kerr appoints Fraser so he can get the advice that he wants, which is for a double dissolution. Supply is passed by the Parliament, but just before Whitlam leaves Kerr's office, Kerr sort of wishes him luck, best luck. You know, like he's the underdog kind of in the situation, because maybe the dismissal will help him. You know, he's as if this idea that he's been unfairly treated and the public might return him. You know, the polls showed that a majority of the public wanted the budget to be passed. But the 1975 election was one of the most devastating landslide losses for Labor. It was one of the best results the Liberals have ever had. What happened during the 75 election?
I think being the only government ever dismissed by a Governor-General would sort of do that to you. And not to be too flippant, it was met, as you would probably expect, with a complete turnaround in the way in which the electoral polling had been travelling up to that point. One of the things that was very clear during the blocking of supply was that the Liberal Country Party were hemorrhaging votes. And there were a series of opinion polls, they were usually held sort of weekly at that time, that showed that in 1 week alone, Fraser's rating plummeted 10 percentage points. And so that's why this concern that the longer supply was blocked, the more the polling was actually in support of the government and turning around what had been pretty poor electoral circumstances in the weeks before that, was growing in the government. So really Kerr stepping in, I think a lot of people felt, well, something terrible has happened that we don't yet know about. There are a lot of media reports of what the Governor-General really knows, you know, suggesting some sort of nefarious activity that Kerr had not been able to share with the public. And just, I think, the impact of a government being dismissed by the Governor-General was that clearly something shocking was happening at the governmental level. All of that, I think, is a corollary of the nature of the dismissal itself, the upheaval that it caused. And you have to remember that this was the third election the Labor Party had faced in the same number of years. They did not have the sort of money that the Liberal Party had. Effectively, by November 1975, they were completely broke. They had to run another major election campaign without sufficient funding, and they were doing so from the immense disadvantage of opposition. They were not even given the capacity as an incumbent government, which is what they were. They'd been an elected government. They should have been the incumbent government at the very least for the election purposes, and they weren't. They'd had to move out of their offices. It was a shambles, and it was a shocking campaign, it was a shocking election and an appalling result. But that all, in my view, hinged on the fact that the government had been dismissed and that so much of what had happened on that day and in the weeks before were not told to the Australian public and not told to any of us for many decades to come through the archival searches that I and others have been doing over the last 20 years in particular.
Ultimately, with all the things in mind, the senators about to crack, the legal advice that Kerr had, and all the other context around it, is it fair to say that Kerr made the wrong choice and this crisis could have gone entirely different or not happened at all, really, had Kerr acted differently?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Kerr had options and he chose the most divisive, polarising and politically destructive option that he could possibly have taken. And it was a partisan option. It was an option where effectively he was taking the advice of the opposition ahead of the advice of elected government. And that is truly shocking. What Kerr should have done and what was mapped out for him very clearly was exactly as Sir Paul Hasluck, the previous Governor-General, had done in 1974 when Billy Snedden's led Liberal Party moved to begin the process of blocking supply in the Senate, but did not actually get there. And that is that he should have accepted Whitlam's advice for the half-Senate election, contingent on supply being passed by the Senate. At that point, the supply bills would have been reintroduced into the Senate as they were at the top of the notice paper for that day in any case, for that purpose. And the Liberal senators who were on the verge of cracking would have allowed the supply bills to pass, knowing that it had the Governor-General's imprimatur as support for the Whitlam government's recommendation for a half-Senate election. That would have, in my view, immediately ended the so-called crisis, which remained a political crisis, not a constitutional crisis. By acting as he did, Kerr transformed what was still a political issue in front of the Parliament into a constitutional crisis of his own making. And the tragedy for Kerr is that he paid dearly for that. He was shunned by people, he was shunned by those he put into office. He was forced to resign after a humiliating meeting with the Queen, who made it clear to him that she thought it best if he left. He was forced into unwanted exile in the UK, despite him repeatedly saying he was more than happy to live there. His private papers tell a very different story. And ultimately, Kerr is one of the most, I would say, disrespected of any of the Governors-General we have had by a long mile. And the great tragedy is he brought that on himself.
A very strong closing statement. Well, thank you so much, Professor Hocking, for your insight and time today. Quite a lot of time dissecting the dismissal. So thank you very much.
Great pleasure, David, and all the best.
And there you have it. Thank you so much to Professor Jenny Hocking for her time and expertise to help us unpack the dismissal. It is one of the great defining moments of Australian political history, and it is also a pretty large thing to try and unpack in a short amount of time, if you count an hour as a short amount of time. There is so much more to learn about it. Thank you so much to my supporters on Patreon. The link is in the description. If you'd like to support me, give me $1 or $2 a month just to help support free education for everyone. If you'd like to learn more about Australian politics, subscribe to me, give me a follow, give me a like. A comment down below would be really nice to let me know what you'd like to learn about next or who I should interview next. And that's all from me. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll see you next time.